Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing the mid-year book freakout tag, which is a yearly booktube staple to reflect on the first half of the year's reading. I don't believe the original video is still available, but I will link the original creators below so you can check out their channels. But this year, I overall have had a pretty good reading year so far. I've been reading a lot fewer books, I feel like, than I normally do, but I've been enjoying a lot more of those books that I have been reading, so that's really great. But yeah, let's just get into it. So the first question is the best book you've read so far in 2022. Because I have been enjoying my reading, I'm going to give you my top 3 books that I have read so far this year. The first one is The Dark Mirror by Juliet Marillier. So this is actually a reread, but it's been so long since I read it that it was almost like reading it brand new. But this is historical fantasy by one of my favorite authors of all time, Juliet Marillier, and it is following BRIDEI, who was a Pictish king, from childhood, growing up, and him kind of growing into his destiny of becoming this great Pictish king. And it has less magic in it, I think, than a lot of her other series, but her writing always is so like atmospheric and feels so magical. And I loved this series. I think this series has some definite flaws to it. I have a whole series review that I'll link below if you want to hear a little bit more about it, but I just enjoyed this so much. I reread the entire trilogy this year, and it was just so great to reread. But the first book, following BRIDEI and also Twala, who is another character in this, was just, I think, the best in the series. Next up, we have, I guess we're kind of going in order that I read them. Next is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, and this is one that I've just been meaning to get to for so long, and I finally did this year, and I'm so glad that I did because I enjoyed it so much. It is fantasy that is inspired by the cultures of pre-Columbian America. We're following a few different characters. One of them is a priestess. One is this like ship captain who has been exiled from her community. And then our third character is this kind of chosen one, like destined, like guy who has like this destiny that has sort of like resigned to his fate. And he's like incredibly powerful and very scary looking, but kind of like it seems like a kind of sweet person. I just enjoyed his character so much. But yeah, so it's about these 3 characters and all of their storylines kind of converging. I loved the world. The way in which the world is written is not very there isn't a lot of like exposition really explaining the world, but I think that you get such a strong feeling for this world that you really feel like you understand it because of her writing. It was just such a great read. And then the third one that I have is my most recent, which is Spear by Nicola Griffith. This is a fantasy Arthurian retelling. It's like a queer gender bent Arthurian retelling specifically about Percival. And I just had such a fun time reading this. Arthurian retellings are things that can be a little hit or miss for me, but this was definitely a hit. I absolutely adored this. And it's one of those kind of like Arthurian adjacent stories that I love, where it takes elements of the original stories and kind of reimagines them in a more interesting way, but is also, a lot of it is about the time and place and atmosphere and like the real magical feel of the book. So I had a really great time reading this. I have reviews for both of these as well, and a video that is recommendations for other Arthurian adjacent stories if you're interested in that. So I will link tons of videos below. Okay, so those were my favorite books that I've read so far this year. Question 2 is the best sequel that you've read so far this year. This one was very easy for me to choose because there's a clear winner for me, which is Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. So this is the second book in the Daevabad trilogy, which is a fantasy series where we start out following a thief in 18th century Cairo. The blue of this book always throws off the balance of like my camera. But we start following this thief in 18th century Cairo. She's not a thief, she's a con woman. And so she like does this kind of fake ritual, which turns out to be a real ritual, and accidentally summons a Jinn warrior who then whisks her away to Daevabad, which is a magical city that humans don't know about, but they are in the midst of like political upheaval, and that really like sets the series off. And I just adored this sequel. It had a bit of a slow start, and I wasn't really sure if I was going to be into it, but then I got so obsessed with it once I really got into the story. I love the way that the characters are written. I also read the third book, so that is also a great sequel, but this second one really was my favorite in the series, I think. And I just love the way that all of these characters are written, because you understand all of their motives and actions and feelings so well that even though we're following people who are all on different like sides of this multifaceted conflict, and they have all done terrible things to each other in various ways, you understand why each of them has done what they've done and why each of them hates the other for what they have done. I just think that they're all so well written, and I loved it. Okay, so next question is a new release you haven't read yet but want to. There are so many new releases that I haven't read yet but I want to, but one of the ones that is top of my mind at the moment is Seasonal Fears by Shauna Maguire. So this is the companion sequel to Middle Game, which was one of my favorite books a couple of years ago. I loved Middle Game. I have heard some middling reviews for this one, that it doesn't quite live up to Middle Game, so I'm trying to go in with pretty managed expectations, but I am still just really excited to get back into this world, but with some new characters. Alright, next up is most anticipated release for the second half of the year. I actually recently did an entire video about my most anticipated releases for the second half of the year, so I will link that below as well. But I think one of my like #1 most anticipated releases is The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang. So Neon Yang wrote the Tensorate series, which is a series of novellas that are silk punk fantasy. I read them last year and they were maybe my favorite thing that I read last year. I just really love that series. And so this is Neon Yang's first like full novel, but it is sci-fi. I don't tend to read a lot of sci-fi, but I'm just so excited to have something new from Neon Yang that it is one of my, if not my very most anticipated release for the second half of the year. Okay, then we have biggest disappointment. I don't feel like this year I've had a lot of like huge disappointments. I feel like this was a hard one for me to pick, so I just went with The Circle by Sarah B. Elfgren and Matt Strandberg. This is a YA like paranormal contemporary fantasy-ish this is translated from Swedish, I believe, but I had seen this recommended for people who enjoy the Raven Cycle. They'd kind of pitched it as like, if you like the Raven Cycle, this is kind of like that, but if all the characters were girls. And I DNF'd this. I got maybe like a quarter of the way into it and just was like, I don't like or care about any of these characters. I feel like the characterization really wasn't there. This, I think, was a disappointment because although I was not expecting this to be exactly like The Raven Cycle, and I was not expecting it to be as good as, like, The Raven Cycle is one of my favorite series, and so I do not, even when I go into books that are compared to that, I do not expect them to be like as good in my personal subjective estimation or to like touch my heart in the same way, but I still had a little bit of an expectation from it, and it just really didn't live up to that. So I guess this was one of my biggest disappointments. All right, next up is biggest surprise. I have a few surprises. Like, I think there are a couple of books that I have already mentioned that I could say are surprises. Like, Spear was really a surprise for me just because I had no real expectations for it, and because, as I said, Arthurian retellings can be very hit or miss for me, so it was definitely a surprise for me in how much I enjoyed it, because I went into it kind of being like, this could go very badly, and then it went very well. Another one that I already mentioned that was a real surprise was Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty, because I read the first book in this series like 2 years ago, and when I read it, I thought it was okay. I didn't love it, and honestly, I probably would not have continued on in the series after the first book if I didn't already have the second one. This one was given to me, so I had it already, so I was like, okay, I may as well just give it a try and see what happens. So I went into this with very low expectations, thinking that I might even DNF it, because while like the first book was okay, I didn't love it, and I wasn't thinking I was going to continue on this series. And then I absolutely loved this. But just to add another one that was probably one of my biggest surprises for the year, is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. So this was a real surprise for me, partially because I have read something from this author before. I believe it was called The Raven and the Reindeer, and I didn't love it. So I wasn't really like committed to trying other books from this author. This is one that was like on my radar, but I wasn't really planning to read it because I hadn't had a great experience with the author the first time. However, granted, the book that I read first may not have been the best place to start with this author. That may have been a little bit of user error. Anyway, so it was a surprise in that way. It was also a surprise because I hadn't really intended to read it. Like, this was an impulse buy, an impulse read. I just happened to be at a Barnes & Noble and decided to pick it up. So I went into it with pretty like open expectations, a little bit of low expectations based on my previous experience, and it was really just like an impulsive read. And then I ended up enjoying this so much, and now I'm thinking that maybe I will try other things from T. Kingfisher, and that maybe the first one that I read just like wasn't the best place to start, but maybe I'll like other things from this author. Okay, so next question is favorite new author. I don't know if I have like a favorite new author. I kind of interpret this as like, not that this is a new all-time favorite author, but of the authors that I have read this year, which is a favorite so far. So I could once again say S.A. Chakraborty. I think that finishing this trilogy, reading the second and third books this year, has kind of cemented her as maybe an auto-buy, auto-read kind of author. I know she has a new series coming out next year that I'm very excited about, just because I enjoy so much the way in which she writes characters, which is something that's like so important to me when I'm reading books. If I love the characterization and the complexity of these characters and their dynamics and how well you can understand them. So I think that she's probably become, even though I read the first book a couple of years ago, finishing these books this year cemented her as an author that I'm definitely going to be reading more from, and maybe like an auto read author for me. Then we have newest fictional crush, which I always skip this question because I don't have a fictional crush. And now newest favorite character. My favorite character probably from the books that I have read so far this year is Serapio from Black Sun. He is just like a terrifying sweet little bean, and I love him so much. I am so excited to read more about him. I have the sequel to this and I just need to get around to reading it, but I'm really excited to read more about him because like he was just a delight. Next question is a book that made you cry. I don't think that I have cried at any books so far this year, so I don't have an answer for this. Then a book that made you happy. I reread quite a few books this year, especially like contemporaries that were ones that were just very like feel-good, happy books. So I reread the first two Heartstopper graphic novels, which definitely made me happy. I really enjoyed those because they're just like so cute and so wholesome. I also reread some of Talia Hibbert's books from the Brown sisters. I reread Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and Act Your Age, Eve Brown, which are my two favorites from the trilogy. And those also just like always make me happy. So those are probably the ones that I've read so far this year that made me the happiest. Then we have the most beautiful book you've bought so far this year. I have bought some very beautiful books this year, but one of my most recent buys that I just absolutely love this cover is Woman of Light by Kali Fajardo Anstein. This is just so beautiful. I love a color gradient, and these colors are so beautiful. I love this cover so much. I don't have much else to say about it other than just like, look at it. It's beautiful. All right. And then the last question is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? There are honestly too many. Too many to count. But one of the books that is on my mind as a book that I really want to read by the end of the year is Dreaming the Eagle by Amanda Scott. It is historical fiction about Queen Boudica. And I am hoping actually that maybe I'll get to it this month, but I really want to read it soon because I just have a really good feeling about it. Like I feel like I'm gonna love it. So that is one of my top priority books. I am going to be doing a video kind of reflecting on how I've done so far on my like top 10 books to read this year and my top series to read this year. So those are all ones that the ones that I haven't read yet from those lists, those are all some of the ones that I feel like I need to read by the end of the year. But that video will be coming out shortly. Anyways, that is my, I almost said most anticipated releases. That is my mid-year book freakout tag. It's always a fun tag to do. Can't believe, you know, have to obligatory like, can't believe it's the beginning or the middle of the year already, but truly can't believe it. Anyway, I'd love to know, how is your year going? What is your favorite thing that you've read so far this year? But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!